512 days. That is how long it took from the moment Kirksey McCord Nix decided that Vincent and Margaret Sherry needed to die, to the moment someone walked into their house in Biloxi, Mississippi, and made that decision permanent. 512 days of planning, of phone calls made from a prison cell, of money changing hands between men whose names would not surface for years, of a sitting judge going to work every morning, drinking his coffee, sleeping in his house, completely unaware that the most dangerous man on the Gulf Coast had already signed his death warrant. Nix was 200 miles away when it happened. He was locked inside Parchman Farm, a penitentiary so brutal that the United Nations once called it a human rights violation with a zip code. Distant meant nothing to him. It never had. The American South after the Second World War was not a uniform landscape of religious conservatism and quiet rural tradition. That is the version the region preferred to project, the version that existed alongside it. In the port cities, in the resort strips along the Gulf Coast, in the roadhouses and gambling dens and backroom operations of a dozen mid-sized southern cities, was something considerably darker and considerably more profitable. The infrastructure of organized crime requires certain conditions to flourish: corrupt local government, economic desperation in the surrounding population, tolerance from law enforcement that can be purchased rather than earned, and geographic distance from the federal scrutiny that concentrates in major metropolitan areas. The American South of the 1950s and 1960s offered all of these conditions in abundance. The Italian-American organized crime families, La Cosa Nostra, the mob, the outfit, had established dominant positions in the major cities of the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast: New York, Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, Los Angeles. These were mob cities, their criminal economies structured by the formal hierarchies of the five families and their equivalents in other regions. The mob structure was elaborate and specific: bosses, underbosses, capos, soldiers, associates, a hierarchy that produced accountability within the organization and predictability in its dealings with the outside world. The South was different territory. The Italian-American families had limited presence in the region, primarily in New Orleans through the Carlos Marcello organization, and scattered influence in a handful of other Gulf Coast cities. But vast stretches of the South, the Mississippi Gulf Coast, the rural corridors of Alabama and Georgia, the casino and vice strips along the Florida Panhandle, the backroads of Tennessee and Arkansas, were outside the formal mob structure entirely. Into that space came something that had no formal structure, no initiation ceremony, no consigliere to manage disputes, and no rules beyond the single rule that governed all of its transactions. Violence was the currency, and anyone who could not spend it was not in the game. The term Dixie Mafia was coined by law enforcement and journalists in the late 1960s and early 1970s to describe what they were observing across the South: a loose, interconnected web of career criminals who moved across state lines, committing armed robberies, murders for hire, drug trafficking, and gambling operations with a fluidity that conventional law enforcement, organized around jurisdictional lines, found extraordinarily difficult to track or prosecute. It was not really a mafia. It had no godfather. It had no commission to settle disputes. It had no territorial agreements formalized in any structure that could be mapped or infiltrated in the way that La Cosa Nostra could be mapped and infiltrated. What it had was men who were capable of extraordinary violence and willing to use it without the hesitation that conscience or organizational structure might impose. That willingness was, in the specific geography and specific historical moment of the American South in the post-war decades, enough to build something that traditional organized crime found simultaneously useful and deeply unsettling. This is where that story began. The criminal networks that would eventually attract the Dixie Mafia label did not spring into existence at a single moment. They developed across the 1950s and 1960s through a confluence of factors specific to the American South's particular social, economic, and political geography. The Gulf Coast was the epicenter. The stretch of coastline running from New Orleans east through Biloxi and Gulfport in Mississippi, continuing through Mobile in Alabama and on to the Florida Panhandle, had been a zone of vice and entertainment for generations before anyone applied the Dixie Mafia label to the criminal operations that ran through it. The coastal cities had resort economies, hotels, restaurants, gambling operations both legal and illegal, entertainment that attracted working-class and middle-class tourists from the interior South who came to the coast for the specific purpose of doing things they could not do at home. Biloxi, Mississippi occupied a particular position in this geography. The city sat on a narrow strip of land between the Gulf of Mexico and Back Bay, with its main commercial street running along the beachfront. Through the 1940s and 1950s, Biloxi had developed one of the most concentrated strips of illegal gambling operations in America, outside of Nevada and the New Jersey boardwalk, slot machines in grocery stores, card games in the back rooms of restaurants, bookmaking operations that handled sports betting from across the region. The local political structure had determined, collectively and with remarkable consistency across administrations, that enforcing gambling laws was not a priority. The tourist economy that the gambling attracted was too valuable, the political donations from the establishment operators too significant, and the local tradition of looking the other way too deeply embedded to permit any particular crusader to change the fundamental arrangement. This was not unique to Biloxi. The Florida Panhandle communities of Pensacola and Panama City operated similar arrangements. Parts of Nashville, Tennessee had their own gambling and vice economies protected by comparable political structures. The Louisiana Gulf Coast, under the particular criminal patronage of Carlos Marcello's New Orleans organization, had its own elaborately corrupt vice ecosystem. What these geographically separate operations shared was the infrastructure of corruption. The specific arrangements between criminal operators and local government that made the operations possible, sheriffs who did not see slot machines, judges who routinely reduced charges to misdemeanors for defendants with the right connections, city council members who understood that their campaign contributions had conditions attached. These arrangements were not incidental to the vice economy. They were its structural foundation. The criminal operators who ran the casinos and gambling dens were not, for the most part, the violent career criminals who would later be associated with the Dixie Mafia label. They were businessmen of a specific type, men who had identified a profitable market that legal commerce was not permitted to serve, had built the infrastructure to serve it, and had invested in the political relationships that allowed them to continue operating. Their violence, when it occurred, was the targeted violence of competitive market participants protecting market share, rather than the systematic violence of organizations built around force. The violent criminal class that developed alongside and eventually parasitically on top of the Gulf Coast vice economy was a different population. These were men who came from the economic margins of Southern society, from the rural poverty of Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee, from the fringes of the military communities that had grown up around the Gulf Coast's naval installations during and after the war, from the specific culture of masculine violence that the rural South cultivated and the urban South inherited. They had been raised in a world where violence resolved disputes, where weakness was exploited rather than tolerated, and where the formal legal system was understood to be an apparatus operated by and for people with money and connections, which is to say, not for them. Their relationship to the law was adversarial from the beginning, and became more so through their criminal careers. The specific operations that defined the early Dixie Mafia criminal network were simpler and more direct than the elaborate structures of the Italian-American mob. Armed robbery was the foundational activity. Teams of 2 to 4 men would hit commercial targets, liquor stores, grocery stores, gas stations, small banks, across a region, moving between states to reduce the chance of any single police department developing enough cases to build a pattern. The interstate movement was strategic rather than accidental. It exploited the jurisdictional divisions of American law enforcement in an era before the FBI's involvement in state-level crimes was routine, and before the information-sharing systems that would later connect local law enforcement databases existed in usable form. A crew operating out of Nashville might rob liquor stores in Alabama on Monday, grocery stores in Mississippi on Wednesday, and be back in Tennessee by Friday. Each jurisdiction had partial information. No jurisdiction had the complete picture. The pattern was visible from above, from the FBI's perspective when they eventually began looking, but invisible from any individual local law enforcement agency's position. The crews were connected not by formal organizational membership, but by reputation and by the specific social networks of Southern prison systems. Men who had done time together at Mississippi State Penitentiary, Parchman Farm, or at the Alabama State Penitentiary, or at Tennessee's prisons built relationships inside that extended outside when they were released. They knew who could be trusted to do a job without breaking, who could be relied upon to move quickly, who was reliable with a weapon when a job went wrong. This prison network foundation is critical to understanding how the Dixie Mafia functioned. The formal mob's organizational structure was built around family ties, ethnic community, and formal initiation into a specific criminal organization, with rules, obligations, and penalties for violation. The Dixie Mafia's organizational structure was built around the shared experience of incarceration, around the specific bonds that develop between men in environments of enforced proximity and mutual vulnerability, and around the shared criminal worldview that Southern prisons of the mid-20th century were extraordinarily effective at producing. Parchman Farm deserves particular attention in this context. The Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman was, through the mid-20th century, one of the most brutal penal institutions in America. It operated on a plantation model. Inmates performed agricultural labor on the facility's extensive landholdings under the supervision of armed trustees who were themselves inmates with special status. Physical punishment was routine. The racial hierarchy of Mississippi society was reproduced and intensified inside the facility. The conditions were, by any humane standard, appalling. For the career criminal who came through Parchman and survived it, the experience was formative in a specific way. It confirmed that the world was organized around power and violence. It created networks of relationships with other career criminals that extended across the region, and it produced, in the men who emerged from it, a specific quality of hardness, not the theatrical hardness of criminal mythology, but the actual psychological adaptation of people who have survived genuinely brutal conditions and who have recalibrated their expectations of what life requires. The men who emerged from Parchman and from Mississippi's county jails and from the equivalent institutions across the South in the 1950s and 1960s went back to the communities they came from, reconnected with the networks they had built inside, and continued the careers that had put them in those institutions in the first place. The revolving door of Southern criminal justice was not, in this era, an accident or a failure. It was the predictable output of a system that warehoused people without rehabilitation and released them into the same conditions that had produced the original criminal behavior. These men were the social base of what became the Dixie Mafia. They were not an organization in any formal sense. They were a population, a specific demographic of career criminals distributed across the American South, connected by prison relationships and criminal reputation, capable of violence, and operating in territories where corruption had created space for their activities. The specific label Dixie Mafia was applied to this population by an agent of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, a federal law enforcement organization that preceded the DEA, who was attempting to describe to congressional investigators the pattern of criminal activity he was observing in the southern states in the late 1960s. The label stuck because it was vivid and because it captured something real. There was a network of sorts. It was southern, and it operated with the casual brutality that the word mafia implied to American ears trained by decades of organized crime coverage. What the label obscured was the specific character of the network's difference from the Italian-American mob. The difference was not merely structural. The absence of formal hierarchy, the absence of initiation, the absence of the specific cultural forms that La Cosa Nostra had developed. The difference was also operational and psychological. The Dixie Mafia's willingness to kill was not governed by the cost-benefit calculation that rational criminal organizations apply to murder. The recognition that killing attracts law enforcement attention, that federal involvement follows high-profile murders, that the long-term business interests of a criminal organization are served by limiting violence to what is strictly necessary. The Dixie Mafia killed because it could, because violence was the medium through which its members understood all relationships, and because the specific men at its core had developed, through their specific histories, a relationship to human life that made murder a comparatively uncomplicated operational decision. This is what made the Italian-American mob, in those instances where they had contact with the southern criminal networks, genuinely uneasy. The mob could not control an organization that had no structure to leverage. It could not make agreements that would be honored by a network without enforcement mechanisms for its own members, and it could not calculate the consequences of dealing with men whose responses to any provocation or complication was likely to be more violent than the situation analytically warranted. The Dixie Mafia was not the mob's southern cousin. It was something the mob did not have a framework for managing. In a conventional organized crime structure, violence is regulated, not ethically. Nobody in the boardrooms of La Cosa Nostra was concerned with the morality of killing, but operationally. A murder required approval from above. The commission that governed relations between the 5 New York families had specific rules about the killing of made members that required consensus at the highest levels of the organization. Even the murder of civilians, bookmakers who didn't pay, loan shark victims who ran, was understood to carry costs. Police attention, newspaper coverage, political pressure that made the business environment less comfortable. The calculus produced a criminal organization that was violent, but not indiscriminately so. Violence was a tool, deployed with the same cost-benefit logic that governed other operational decisions. When it made sense, it was used. When it didn't, alternatives were found. The Dixie Mafia operated on a different calculus. Or rather, it operated without a calculus at all, in the conventional sense. There was no approval structure for murder, because there was no structure. There was no cost-benefit analysis, because the men who made the decisions had a fundamentally different relationship to the concept of cost. They had grown up in environments where violence was not a last resort but a first language, where disputes were settled physically rather than through the negotiation and mediation that organized crime hierarchies developed to manage internal conflicts without the expense of killing. The absence of structure had a paradoxical effect on the Dixie Mafia's relationship to violence. It made murder simultaneously more frequent and more unpredictable. More frequent because there was no approval process that might slow the decision or redirect it toward a less final resolution. More unpredictable because the decision was made by individual men according to their individual temperament rather than by an organization applying consistent rules. Some of the violence was transactional. Murder for hire was a genuine business line for certain Dixie Mafia figures, particularly for those who had developed reputations for reliability and competence in the specific sense that the contract-killing business requires. A man who would do what he was paid to do without leaving evidence, without talking afterward, and without developing a conscience about it, between the agreement and the execution, was a valuable resource in a criminal ecosystem where the need for that service was periodic and reliable. The contract-killing economy of the American South in the 1960s and 1970s was larger than most people who have not specifically studied it would imagine. Businessmen who wanted partners eliminated, husbands who wanted wives dead and insurance collected, crime figures who wanted rivals neutralized without the direct involvement that would make them obvious suspects. Domestic disputes that escalated past the point where conventional resolutions seemed available. The demand for murder services in American society at any given historical moment is not trivial, and the supply that the Dixie Mafia's violent criminal population could provide was specifically suited to that demand. The mechanics of the contract-killing business in the Dixie Mafia context were informal rather than the structured arrangements of crime fiction. A criminal figure who needed a killing done would communicate the need, directly or through an intermediary, to someone known to provide such services. A price would be established, typically in cash, paid in advance, or split between advance and completion. The killer would execute the job using his own judgment about method and timing, then collect the balance. The lack of formal structure that characterized the Dixie Mafia generally produced, in the contract-killing business specifically, a reliability problem that more formally organized crime avoided. A hitman who worked for the mob knew that non-performance, taking the advance and not completing the job, or completing it incompetently in ways that left evidence connecting to the client, would have specific and severe consequences enforced by the organization that had brokered the arrangement. A hitman who worked in the loose Dixie Mafia network faced no such institutional accountability. The consequences for non-performance were whatever the client was personally capable of imposing, which varied considerably. This produced periodic situations of extraordinary violence in which the parties to a murder-for-hire arrangement turned on each other. Clients who felt they had been defrauded, killers who feared they would be silenced, intermediaries caught between parties with conflicting interests in the transaction's outcome. The murder-for-hire economy of the Dixie Mafia was itself a source of murders, layered on top of the murders it was contracted to produce. The roving armed robbery networks operated with their own violence calculus. The fundamental problem with armed robbery as a criminal business model is that it creates confrontations between armed criminals and people who did not expect to be confronted by armed criminals. The resolution of these confrontations, whether the victim complied, resisted, or panicked, was only partially controllable by the criminal. The criminal could minimize the probability of violent outcomes by moving quickly, by selecting targets unlikely to have armed employees, and by maintaining a credible threat that was more terrifying than actual violence. But the element of human unpredictability in high-stress confrontations meant that violence was an ever-present possibility. The Dixie Mafia robbery crews handled this probability distribution differently from how rational criminologists might recommend. Rather than treating violence as a last resort to be avoided in the interest of avoiding the additional criminal exposure that murder created, many crews operated with a philosophy that witnesses were liabilities to be eliminated as a matter of routine. This approach, killing people who had seen them, killing people who could describe them, killing store clerks who could identify the route of a robbery series, produced patterns of lethal violence that made the investigation of Dixie Mafia armed robbery networks a qualitatively different law enforcement problem from investigating ordinary robbery crews. The witness elimination practice was not universal, and it was not an organizational policy in any formal sense. It was a tendency, a characteristic of the specific men who populated the most violent end of the Dixie Mafia spectrum, and who operated according to their individual judgment about what constituted an acceptable risk. The problem, from law enforcement's perspective, was that the most violent operators were also often the most prolific. They ran more jobs, generated more income from their criminal operations, and built larger networks of associates and clients than their less violent counterparts, because their willingness to use maximum force made them more effective at the operational level, even as it made them more legally dangerous in the long term. The geography of the Dixie Mafia's operations spread across the South with the specific pattern of criminals following profitable targets across territorial boundaries. The Mississippi Gulf Coast remained a hub, both for the vice economy that provided cover and clients, and for the specific criminal culture that Biloxi and the surrounding communities had developed over decades. But the networks extended into Tennessee, into Alabama and Georgia, into the Florida Panhandle, into Arkansas and Louisiana. The spread was facilitated by the interstate highway system, which was transforming American geography through the 1960s and 1970s in ways that benefited mobile criminal operations, just as it benefited mobile legitimate commerce. A robbery crew in 1965 that was limited to what a two-lane state highway could reach operated in a relatively small geographic radius. A crew in 1975 with access to the interstate system could cover 5 states in a week without straining the vehicle or the schedule. Law enforcement's jurisdictional organization did not adapt to this geographic expansion at equivalent speed. County sheriffs and city police departments remained the primary law enforcement presence in most of the territory the Dixie Mafia operated in, and their capacity for interstate cooperation was limited by communication systems, budgets, and the political independence of the county-level law enforcement structure that characterized the South. State police organizations existed, but varied enormously in their capacity and their willingness to pursue mobile criminal networks across their borders. The FBI's involvement in state-level crime remained limited by the statutory framework that governed federal jurisdiction, which required a federal crime, interstate transportation, civil rights violations, specific federal statutes, as a predicate before federal involvement was legally available. The organizational sophistication of the Dixie Mafia was not, ultimately, very high. The individual members of the network were not criminal masterminds in the sense of complex planning and elaborate execution. They were men who were willing to commit violence, who had accumulated criminal skills and criminal networks through their careers and their prison time, and who operated in a geography and political environment that tolerated their activities more than most comparably sized criminal populations would have been tolerated anywhere else in America. But the absence of sophistication in individual operations was compensated for by the cumulative effect of many men operating simultaneously across a wide geography with minimal coordination, a distributed criminal network whose very lack of central coordination made it resistant to the investigative techniques that worked against centrally organized criminal enterprises. You cannot cut off the head of an organization that has no head. You cannot flip one member to reveal the rest if membership is determined by reputation and criminal relationship, rather than by formal structure that can be documented and mapped. This was the first and most fundamental problem that law enforcement faced in the Dixie Mafia era. The second problem was that the law enforcement it was dealing with in the specific geography where the Dixie Mafia operated most densely was frequently part of the problem. The city of Biloxi, Mississippi in the 1960s and 1970s was two cities simultaneously occupying the same geography. The first city was a Gulf Coast resort town with a fishing economy, a military installation at Keesler Air Force Base, and a beachfront that attracted working-class vacationers from across the Deep South looking for a few days of sun and seafood and relief from the interior heat. This city was the one that appeared in the tourist brochures, that the Chamber of Commerce described, that the local newspaper covered in its front-page stories about new hotels and fishing tournaments and high school football. The second city operated after dark, in the establishments that lined US Highway 90 along the beachfront and in the side streets running back from the water. This was the city of slot machines in every restaurant and grocery store, of card games running continuously in back rooms, of bookmaking operations that handled action from across the South, of strip clubs and brothels, and the various other enterprises that the entertainment economy of a resort city with tolerant law enforcement can sustain. It was the city that the Chamber of Commerce did not describe, and that the newspaper covered only when it could not avoid doing so. The second city was controlled, in a practical sense, by a collection of operators who had built their businesses over decades through a combination of commercial skill, political investment, and the specific willingness to use or commission violence that the vice economy required when competitive disputes could not be resolved through other means. These operators were not, for the most part, characterized by the extreme violence of the Dixie Mafia's robbery and murder-for-hire networks. They were businessmen who happened to be in illegal businesses, and their primary skill was the management of political relationships, rather than the management of armed confrontations. The political management began with the Harrison County Sheriff's Office, and the Biloxi Police Department, both of which operated through the mid-20th century in a relationship to the vice economy that was more symbiotic than adversarial. Law enforcement in a community where the local political structure has decided that vice is acceptable becomes, in practice, a protective service for the vice operators rather than an enforcement mechanism against them. The protection takes various forms: advance notice of any raids that might be planned by state or federal agencies, selective enforcement that targets competitors of the established operators while leaving the protected operators undisturbed, and the simple daily reality that officers do not see what they have been taught not to see. The specific arrangements through which Biloxi's protection system operated involved money, campaign contributions to sheriffs and city council members, cash payments to individual officers on a regular schedule, the various other forms of financial gratification that corrupt law enforcement requires and receives. These arrangements were not secret within the community of people who participated in them. They were simply not discussed outside that community, which in Biloxi of the 1950s and 1960s was a large enough community to constitute a substantial portion of the local political and business establishment. The vice operators who operated within this protected environment were themselves not monolithic. There were established families with generational investment in the Gulf Coast, gambling and entertainment economy. There were newer arrivals from other parts of the South who had identified the Mississippi Gulf Coast as a favorable operating environment. There were figures with connections to the New Orleans organized crime structure under Carlos Marcello, who had extended influence along the Gulf Coast as part of Marcello's broader regional operations. The Dixie Mafia's relationship to this established vice economy was complex. The robbery crews and murder-for-hire operators who constituted the most violent end of the Dixie Mafia spectrum were not the same population as the gambling operators who ran Biloxi's casinos. But the two populations overlapped in specific ways. The gambling operators occasionally needed the kind of enforcement that the violent criminal network could provide, and the violent criminal network found in the Gulf Coast vice economy a geography of tolerance that was more hospitable than most of the South. The figure who most visibly embodied the overlap between Biloxi's legitimate adjacent vice economy and the Dixie Mafia criminal network was a man named Mike Gillich. Gillich had been in Biloxi since the 1950s, operating a series of establishments along the Strip, nightclubs and strip clubs that were the social infrastructure of the vice economy, the places where the people who operated in the second city's economy gathered, did business, and maintained the relationships that made the economy function. He was known as a community figure in the specific sense that the Biloxi criminal community understood community, a man who knew everyone of consequence, who facilitated relationships, who was trusted to maintain confidences in a world where confidences were the currency of survival. His establishments, the most famous being the Red Creek Inn, later known as Mike's Strip Club, were not merely entertainment venues. They were nodes in the criminal network, places where people with business to conduct could conduct it in an environment that was private by convention if not by law. Gillich understood that his value to the network was not primarily as an operator of clubs, but as a connector, a man who could introduce a person who needed a service to a person who provided it, who could vouch for the reliability of a criminal partner, who could facilitate the financial arrangements that criminal transactions required. He was also, by the accounts that emerged from federal investigations, decades later, a man who had specific relationships with the murder-for-hire operators who moved through Biloxi's criminal ecosystem. Whether those relationships involved direct commissioning of violence or merely the kind of facilitation that a connector provides. Introductions, vouching, the passing of information was a question that federal investigations would eventually examine in specific and damaging detail. The political structure that protected the vice economy extended upward from the sheriff's office and the police department to the elected officials who set the tone for how law enforcement operated. Biloxi's mayors and city council members through this era maintained varying levels of direct knowledge about and involvement in the protected vice economy. Some were simply politicians who accepted the political reality that the vice operators were the dominant donors in local elections and who governed accordingly. Others were more directly embedded in the corruption, receiving personal financial benefit from their protective relationships with the operators. The specific character of Biloxi's political corruption became nationally visible in the late 1980s and 1990s through the federal investigations that would eventually prosecute several of the city's most prominent figures, including one who had risen to become the city's mayor. But through the 1960s and 1970s, the corruption was local knowledge managed through local silence, an open secret in the way that small city corruption tends to be an open secret, where everyone with any involvement in local public life knows the essential facts, and nobody with a stake in the current arrangement says them plainly. The Keesler Air Force Base presence in Biloxi added a specific dimension to the vice economy that shaped its character throughout this period. The base housed tens of thousands of military personnel at various points, trainees, cycling through technical training programs, permanent party personnel, and the specific population of young men far from home with limited entertainment options and some money to spend. The military population provided a reliable customer base for the Strip's bars, clubs, and gambling operations. It also provided a social environment in which criminally inclined individuals could circulate without the familiarity that made them visible as criminal figures in the smaller communities of the interior South. The strip club and bar economy that serviced the military population generated its own criminal ecosystem, narcotics distribution operations that targeted bar patrons, prostitution operations connected to the clubs, the specific petty crime that concentrations of intoxicated young men with cash generate in their vicinity. These operations were managed by people who were connected, to varying degrees and in varying ways, to the larger Dixie Mafia network, the Harrison County legal system, the courts, and the district attorney's office that sat above the police and sheriff's departments in the criminal justice hierarchy, provided the final layer of protection. Cases that were brought against vice economy operators had a tendency to resolve in ways that the operators found acceptable. Charges reduced through negotiation, evidence excluded through aggressive pretrial motions, sentences imposed that were lighter than the statutes specified. Some of this was the ordinary operation of a legal system in which good defense attorneys produce better outcomes than bad ones, and the vice operators had the money to hire good defense attorneys. Some of it reflected the corruption that extended into the courts themselves. The federal government's awareness of Biloxi's corruption was not absent through this period, but the federal response was limited by the same jurisdictional constraints that limited federal involvement in Dixie Mafia criminal activity. Generally, the FBI could investigate federal crimes. The IRS could investigate tax evasion. The DEA's predecessor agencies could investigate narcotics. but the fundamental political corruption of a small Mississippi city's law enforcement and court system. The daily arrangements between the vice operators and the officials who protected them was not easily reachable through the tools of federal criminal law as it existed through the 1970s and into the 1980s. What eventually reached it was a murder, 2 murders specifically, and the man who ordered them, sitting in a prison cell at Parchman Farm, building an empire from a phone, and the specific ruthlessness of a man who had concluded that the world would bend to his will or be broken. To understand Kirksey McCord Nix Jr., it helps to understand where he came from, because where he came from is not where you might expect the most dangerous criminal in the American South to have originated. He was born in 1942 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. His father, Kirksey Mccord Sr., was a Democratic politician, a man who served in the Oklahoma state legislature and who was, by the standards of 1940s Oklahoma political life, a figure of some regional consequence. The family was not wealthy in the sense of the Oklahoma oil fortunes that defined the state's upper economic stratum, but they were comfortable and connected in the specific way of political families in mid-sized American cities. Kirksey Jr. grew up in an environment that offered him options that most of the men who would eventually make up the Dixie Mafia's population never had. He was intelligent. Several people who knew him across different phases of his life made this point consistently, with the specific note that his intelligence was real rather than the self-serving assessment that criminal figures frequently attract from people within their orbits. He had access to education. He had family connections that could have opened doors to legitimate careers in law, business, or politics. He chose otherwise. The specific sequence of decisions that took Kirksey Nix Jr. from the son of an Oklahoma politician to a convicted murderer serving life in Mississippi's most brutal prison is not fully documented in a way that would satisfy a biographer looking for clear causation. What is clear is that by his early 20s, Nix was deeply embedded in the criminal networks of the southern United States, moving through the overlap between professional gambling operations and the more overtly criminal activity that surrounded them. Professional gambling, the operation of card games, dice games, and sports betting, occupied an interesting position in the Dixie Mafia ecosystem. It was illegal under state laws across the South, but its illegality was of a different character from the illegality of armed robbery or murder. Gambling operations could be run in ways that minimized violent confrontation. They attracted clientele who were participants rather than victims. They required business skills, the management of money, of personnel, of the political relationships that provided protection, rather than purely the willingness to commit violence. But the gambling world intersected with the violent criminal world in specific ways that made the boundary between them porous. Gamblers who cheated or failed to pay required enforcement. Competing operations that encroached on established territory required response. The cash flows that gambling generated made gambling operators targets for robbery, which required the capacity for violent deterrence. And the personality types that populated professional gambling in the criminal South tended toward men who were comfortable operating outside the law in ways that made the transition to more violent criminal activity a gradual slope rather than a sharp cliff. Nix developed his criminal career through this world. By his late 20s, he had established a reputation as a professional gambler and criminal figure of some standing in the networks that ran through Louisiana, Mississippi, and the Gulf Coast. He was known as intelligent, as someone who thought carefully about his operations rather than relying purely on violence. and as someone who could hold his own when violence was necessary. In 1971, Kirksey Nix Jr. was convicted of murder in Louisiana. The specific circumstances of the killing involved a dispute in a criminal context. The kind of confrontation that occurred periodically in the gambling and criminal environments Nix inhabited, where disagreements about money or territory or respect escalated to violence. The details of the crime itself and the evidence that produced the conviction are part of Louisiana court records from that period. What matters for the subsequent story is the sentence: life in prison, to be served in Louisiana's penitentiary system. But through the specific arrangements of the Southern prison system and the geographic complexity of the charges, Nix eventually came to be housed at the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman Farm. At Parchman, Kirksey Nix encountered the specific population and the specific environment that would become the foundation of everything he subsequently built. He encountered men who were career criminals with extensive networks across the South. He encountered the specific social hierarchy of a prison where violence was the primary currency and where intelligence, combined with willingness to use violence, produced influence and protection. And he encountered the particular freedom that Parchman's management practices in that era inadvertently provided to its most sophisticated prisoners. Parchman Farm in the 1970s and into the 1980s was a facility with significant internal management problems. The trustee system, in which prisoners with special status supervised other prisoners, created an internal hierarchy that the prison administration used to manage the facility with minimal staff. It also created the conditions for a shadow governance structure in which men with sufficient intelligence and sufficient violence at their command could effectively control their environment and extend influence beyond the prison walls. Nix understood this environment with the analytical precision that people who had known him consistently attributed to him. He was not the most physically imposing figure in Parchman's population. He was not a man who dominated through brute force. He dominated through intelligence, through reputation, through the specific quality of someone who made clear, through precise and limited violence, rather than constant aggression, that the cost of crossing him exceeded any conceivable benefit. He also dominated through the specific quality that would eventually make him the most significant criminal figure in the American South in the 1980s. The ability to project power outward from his cell into the world beyond the prison walls. Prison management theory in the era, before sophisticated monitoring technology and before modern classification systems, had a fundamental structural weakness. It assumed that incarceration separated the incarcerated person from their external networks. A man in prison could not continue running his criminal operation because he was in prison. Separated from the associates, the cash flows, the communication channels, and the operational freedom that criminal enterprise requires. Kirksey Nix demolished this assumption. He did so through a combination of factors that made his situation unique within the Dixie Mafia universe. First, he had the intelligence to design criminal operations that could be executed remotely, that did not require his physical presence at any stage of their operation, but only his design and his authority. Second, he had the reputation that made people outside the prison walls do what he told them to do, because the consequences of failing Kirksey Nix were understood to be severe and credible, even with him physically confined. Third, he had access to communication that Parchman's management did not adequately control. Telephones were available to prisoners in ways that were not closely monitored. Visitors could carry information and instructions in both directions. Lawyers who represented prisoners, who had privileged access to their clients that was constitutionally protected from interception, could serve as conduits for information that was not entirely limited to legal matters. Fourth, and most importantly for the subsequent story, he had the specific criminal talent that distinguished him from most of his contemporaries, an extraordinary capacity for identifying and exploiting the vulnerabilities of people who had something he wanted. This talent would produce, from a cell at Parchman Farm, one of the most sophisticated and morally depraved criminal operations in American history. It would also produce 2 murders of who had been trusted associates and who had made the specific mistake of believing that their relationship to Kirksey Nix provided them protection from Kirksey Nix. They were wrong. People consistently underestimated how wrong they were. The image of a criminal empire run from a prison cell is the stuff of crime fiction. The godfather in his palace, making decisions that echo across a city, surrounded by lieutenants who carry out his will. The reality of how Kirksey Nix actually ran his operations from Parchman Farm is at once more mundane and more disturbing than the fictional version, because the mundanity is what makes it comprehensible, and the comprehensibility makes its moral dimensions more unsettling. He used the telephone, not constantly, and not without care. Nix understood that telephone communications were potentially monitored and structured his calls accordingly, using coded language and rotating between contact numbers to reduce the surveillance pattern any individual call created. But the essential mechanism of his external criminal operation was the same technology that any business executive or any family member uses to manage relationships across distance. He called people, and they responded to what he told them. The network that responded to his calls had been built across years of criminal life before his incarceration and across the subsequent years of his imprisonment. Some members were people he had known since before his conviction, criminal associates who owed him loyalty or money or both, and who maintained that relationship because the consequences of breaking it remained credible despite his physical confinement. Others were recruited from inside Parchman itself, men who were released from the prison and who, through the specific debt structure that Nix created with people who needed his protection while inside, became obligated to perform services for him on the outside. The debt structure was a specific management innovation that Nix developed at Parchman that reflected his understanding of the social dynamics of prison environments. In a prison where physical safety required protection from stronger or more connected inmates, a man who could provide that protection had a resource to sell. Nix sold protection, or more precisely, he provided it to people he identified as potentially useful and allowed the debt to accumulate, then called in that debt after the person was released in the form of specific services performed in the outside world. The services were varied. Some involved the movement of money, collecting and transmitting funds from various sources to Nix's associates or to accounts his associates maintained. Some involved the carrying of messages or the facilitation of meetings between people in Nix's network who needed to interact without his physical presence. Some, in the most serious cases, involved violence, specifically the hiring and direction of people who would commit murders on Nix's behalf. The financial infrastructure that supported this operation was not sophisticated in the way of modern money laundering. It did not involve offshore accounts, shell corporations, or the complex financial instruments that contemporary financial crime employs. It was operated in cash, moved through personal relationships, and concealed by the simple fact that the people who handled it were not connected to each other through any formal structure that investigators could map and follow. From prison, Nix directed multiple criminal enterprises simultaneously. The most significant of them, the one that eventually generated the most money, attracted the most federal attention, and produced the most damage to the people around him, was the operation that became known in federal court documents and in the journalism that eventually covered the Nix case as the gay telephone scam. Before that operation is described in its full detail, it is necessary to understand what the operation was built on. Nix's extraordinary, almost clinical ability to understand and exploit human vulnerability. This was not an abstract intellectual capacity. It was a specific, applied skill developed through a lifetime of reading people in criminal contexts, where accurately assessing the vulnerabilities of associates, adversaries, and victims was a survival requirement. Every criminal operation ultimately rests on a theory of human weakness, an understanding of what people want badly enough, or fear badly enough, or are ashamed of badly enough, that they can be manipulated into providing what the criminal wants. The crude theory of the armed robbery crew is that people fear immediate violence badly enough to surrender their property. The slightly more sophisticated theory of the con artist is that people's desire for money or status or love can be exploited to convince them to voluntarily surrender their resources. The most sophisticated theory of the fraud operator is that people's specific private vulnerabilities, the things they want or fear that they cannot discuss openly, create the deepest and most reliable lever for exploitation. Kirksey Nix operated with the third theory, and the specific vulnerability he identified as his most productive target was one that the social environment of the 1980s American South made particularly acute and particularly exploitable: the fear, shame, and isolation of gay men in a culture that treated homosexuality as grounds for criminal prosecution, family rejection, employment termination, and social destruction. The scam's design reflected this understanding with a precision that was, in its own horrible way, impressive. It identified a population, gay men across the country, concentrated in urban areas but present everywhere, who had a specific vulnerability. Their sexual orientation was, in many cases, a secret that they needed to protect at significant cost to themselves. It created a mechanism for exploiting that vulnerability at scale, and it used the resources of Nix's prison-based network to execute the mechanism across geography that he himself could not physically reach. The money that the scam generated flowed back toward Nix through channels that required trusted people on the outside to manage. Those people became, through their management of the money flows, both essential to the operation and, as Nix's calculations evolved, potential liabilities. When the liability calculation crossed a threshold that Nix determined required action, the action he took was the same action he had always taken when problems required resolution. He had them killed. The two most significant murders connected to this calculus were the murders of Vincent and Margaret Sherry in September 1987. But to understand the Sherry's deaths, it is necessary to understand the full architecture of the scam that made them targets, which requires following the operation from its prison cell origins through its national execution and back to the Gulf Coast, where the money came to rest. Nix's ability to direct all of this from Parchman Farm was facilitated by several specific features of the prison environment in that era. The telephone access, already noted, was the primary communication channel. The trustee system, which gave favored prisoners significant freedom of movement within the facility, and limited interaction with the outside world through prison work programs provided cover for in-person communications and the attorney-client relationship. The constitutionally protected, privileged communication between a prisoner and his lawyers provided a channel for information exchange that was not legally interceptable. This last channel was the most sensitive because it required lawyers to cross a line between legitimate legal representation and active facilitation of criminal enterprise. The specific lawyers who managed Nix's legal affairs and who became involved in his criminal operations did so through a progression that began with legitimate representation and crossed into criminal involvement through a series of steps, each of which was individually smaller than the aggregate position they eventually occupied. One of those lawyers was a man named Pete Halat. He was Nix's attorney. He was also, at the time, the most serious consequences of his relationship with Nix materialized, the mayor-elect of Biloxi, Mississippi. His story is one of the most extraordinary in the Dixie Mafia narrative. A man who had achieved legitimate professional and political success, who had built a law practice and a political career, and who had simultaneously embedded himself in the criminal operations of a man who was running a murder empire from a prison cell. Understanding Pete Halat's position requires understanding the specific way that the Dixie Mafia, and Kirksey Nix specifically, related to legitimate professional figures. The Italian-American mob had its own lawyers and politicians who served the organization's interests from within legitimate structures. The Dixie Mafia's connections to legitimate professionals were less formal and more transactional, individual relationships built on specific arrangements rather than organizational membership. But the function was the same: legitimacy in the outside world that could be used to facilitate and protect operations that the legitimate world nominally opposed. Halat had been Nix's lawyer for years before the events that eventually destroyed his career and sent him to federal prison. The relationship had begun as a professional one and had evolved through the specific pressures and opportunities that Nix created in all his relationships into something that Halat could not step back from without consequences he could not accept. By the time the full consequences materialized, Biloxi's mayor-elect was implicated in the murder of a sitting judge and his wife. Vincent Sherry was not a man who should have been in the crosshairs of Kirksey Nix's criminal operations. He was a circuit court judge in Harrison County, Mississippi, a former defense attorney who had made the transition to the bench, and who was by most accounts a capable and conscientious jurist. He had served in the military. He had built a law career in Biloxi through the standard combination of legal skill, political connection, and the specific qualities that small city legal practice rewards: reliability, sociability, and the ability to navigate a professional world where everyone knew everyone, and relationships were the primary business infrastructure. His wife, Margaret Sherry, was, if anything, the more politically prominent of the two in their later years. She had served on the Biloxi City Council and had been a visible figure in local civic life, involved in community organizations, engaged with local political issues, possessed of the specific quality of public presence that translates into political capital in small city environments. She was known as direct and energetic, not the kind of person who retreated from conflict or softened her positions to avoid discomfort. That directness, combined with her husband's legal position, had made her a figure whom various people in Biloxi's political and criminal establishment found inconvenient. She had expressed opinions about the corruption that was endemic to the city's political structure. she had the kind of relationship to the truth that people with access to the criminal economy's operations sometimes develop. Knowledge of what was actually happening behind the official narrative that the city's political structure maintained for public consumption. The connection between the Sherrys and Kirksey Nix ran through Pete Hallat. Hallat was both Nix's lawyer and Vincent Sherry's law partner. The three-way relationship, the judge, the mayor-elect, and the murderer in prison, was maintained through the specific intimacy of a small city's professional community where lawyers and judges and politicians operated in close proximity, and where the formal boundaries between professional roles were sometimes less sharp than the institutional descriptions suggested. The money from the gay telephone scam. The operation that Nix was running from Parchman Farm was being managed on the outside through Hallat's law office. This is the allegation that federal investigators developed across years of subsequent investigation, and that federal prosecutions ultimately established in court. The law office was the conduit through which the proceeds of Nix's prison criminal operation were managed, moved, and distributed. Margaret Sherry was believed by Kirksey Nix, based on information he received through his prison network and through communications with people in his orbit, to have knowledge of the money flows and to have access to or control over funds that belonged, in Nix's accounting, to him. The specific nature of her involvement and the nature of Nix's belief about her role was established partially through the investigation and partially through the testimony of witnesses who were themselves participants in various aspects of the criminal enterprise. Nix concluded, with the decisive logic of a man who had resolved every other problem through violence, that the Sherrys needed to die. The decision was made from a prison cell. Its execution was contracted through the network of people who served Nix's interests on the outside. The specific hitman who carried out the murders was brought to Biloxi through arrangements that involved multiple layers of the network, with Nix himself insulated from the direct commission of the murder by enough intermediary steps to create the legal distance that he calculated would protect him. On the night of September 14, 1987, Vincent and Margaret Sherry were at their home in a quiet residential neighborhood in Biloxi. They were not people who maintained significant personal security. They were a judge and a city council member in a mid-sized Mississippi city, public figures by local standards, but not figures who moved through the world with bodyguards or armed drivers or the security awareness of people who understood themselves to be targets of organized criminal violence. The killer or killers entered the house. Vincent Sherry was shot in the den. Margaret Sherry was shot in the hallway. The murders were committed with efficiency and without apparent struggle, beyond what the physical evidence suggested in the positioning of the bodies relative to the entry point. The house was not ransacked. No effort was made to simulate robbery. The killings were what they were, executions, conducted by people who had come to the house for the specific purpose of killing the people inside it. The discovery the following morning produced a shock in Biloxi's civic community that was genuine in its immediate expression and deeply complicated in its underlying reality. A sitting circuit court judge and his wife, a prominent civic figure, murdered in their home. This was not a category of crime that the community had a ready framework for processing. Murders in Biloxi, including murders connected to the criminal economy, were not unknown. But the murder of a judge was a qualitatively different event, carrying implications about the reach of criminal power that the community's official narrative was not prepared to accommodate. The investigation was initially conducted by local law enforcement. The Biloxi Police Department and the Harrison County Sheriff's Department, the same agencies whose relationship to the local criminal economy had been, for decades, the compromised arrangement that the vice operators depended on, and that the federal government had been unable to adequately address. The initial investigation produced, for years, very little of substance. The leads that were developed did not close. The witnesses who might have provided the connections between the murders and their ultimate origin in a Parchman Farm prison cell were not identified, or did not come forward, or were not available to be interviewed by investigators whose access to the criminal network was limited. The FBI became involved relatively quickly as the murder of a judge triggered the federal concern that official corruption and organized crime targeting of the judiciary generates. But FBI involvement did not immediately produce the results that the case required, because the architecture of the crime, the prison-based origin, the multiple intermediary layers, the specific loyalty and fear that Nix commanded in his network made it resistant to the investigative techniques that more conventionally structured criminal cases respond to. Years passed. The Sherry murders remained open. Biloxi continued its dual existence as a Gulf Coast resort city and a criminal economy managed by corrupt political structures. Pete Hallat was elected mayor of Biloxi in 1989, 2 years after the murders of his law partner and his law partner's wife. Murders that, the subsequent investigation would establish, he had been aware of in advance. The specific nature of Hallat's involvement, whether he had actively participated in the planning of the murders, whether he had known of the plan and failed to prevent it, whether he had benefited from the murders in ways that connected him to their commission, was established over years of federal investigation and eventually resolved in federal court proceedings that resulted in his conviction on racketeering charges. The witness, who eventually provided the information that broke the case, was not a law enforcement informant in the conventional sense. He was a man named John Ransom, who had been involved in the operations connected to the Nix network, and who, facing his own legal exposure from those connections, made the calculation that cooperation with federal investigators provided him a better outcome than continued loyalty to a man in a prison cell who could not protect him from the federal charges he was facing. The cooperative witness problem is the central vulnerability of criminal enterprises that depend on personal loyalty rather than formal organizational structure with enforcement mechanisms. The Italian-American mob had methods, imperfect but real, for managing the loyalty of members facing prosecution. The Code of Omertà, backed by the credible threat of death for cooperators, created a cultural and practical barrier to cooperation with law enforcement that was not absolute, but that required investigators to offer substantial benefits to overcome. The Dixie Mafia had no equivalent enforcement mechanism for maintaining loyalty. A member who decided to cooperate faced whatever personal consequences the criminal network could impose, but without the organizational apparatus that the mob used to communicate, track, and execute consequences against cooperators, those consequences were difficult to project reliably. Nix had his reputation. He had the credible threat of violence that had sustained his network for decades. But from a prison cell, with federal investigators now actively working the case and providing the cooperative witnesses protection that his network could not easily penetrate, the leverage of his threat was reduced. The specific testimony that connected the murder of Vincent and Margaret Sherry to Kirksey Nix, to Pete Hallat, and to Mike Gillich unfolded across years of federal proceedings. The evidence that supported the testimony was developed through the investigation of the telephone scam that had been Nix's primary criminal enterprise from prison. An investigation that, when it reached its critical mass, exposed the full architecture of what Nix had built from Parchman Farm and the specific people who had been essential to its operation. The criminal operation that Kirksey Nix designed and ran from his cell at Parchman Farm was, in its essential mechanism, simple. Its target was a specific population's specific vulnerability. Its execution required a network of people making telephone calls. Its yield, over the years it operated, was millions of dollars extracted from people who could not report what was happening to them without revealing the secret that made them targets. To understand why the scam worked requires understanding the specific social and legal environment of gay men in the United States in the 1980s. Homosexuality was, in 1987, still classified as a crime in Mississippi and in a majority of American states under sodomy statutes that remained on the books despite being inconsistently enforced. The social consequences of exposure, for employment, for family relationships, for community standing in the specific cultures of the American South and Midwest, where many of the scam's victims lived, were severe in ways that are difficult to fully convey to people who have come of age in a later era. A gay man in rural Mississippi in 1987 who had not publicly disclosed his sexual orientation was protecting a secret whose exposure could cost him his job, his family relationships, his standing in his religious community, and, in states where sodomy laws were enforced, his freedom. The fear that animated this protective secrecy was not paranoia. It was an accurate assessment of the consequences that exposure had produced for people in equivalent situations in the recent past. This is the vulnerability that Nix's scam targeted. The mechanism worked as follows. Nix's associates on the outside, men who were acting on his direction and splitting the proceeds with him, would make contact with gay men through the personal advertisement sections of gay publications. These publications existed across the country in the 1980s as a mechanism through which gay men could connect with each other in the pre-internet era, typically using post office boxes or anonymous contact methods that provided a degree of privacy. The initial contact was made in the guise of another gay man seeking companionship or romantic connection. Correspondence was exchanged, sometimes for weeks or months, during which the associate developed a relationship with the target, gathering information about his life, his circumstances, and the specific parameters of his vulnerability. How secret was his orientation from his family, his employer, his community? What were his financial resources? What were his specific fears about exposure? When sufficient information had been gathered and sufficient trust established, the nature of the contact changed. The associate would inform the target that he was in trouble, typically that he had been arrested in connection with an illegal act and needed immediate help. The nature of the alleged trouble was calibrated to the specific vulnerabilities identified in the target, sometimes an accusation of soliciting a minor, sometimes a drug charge, sometimes another offense that carried both legal and social exposure if brought to light. The specifics were constructed to be simultaneously believable and terrifying, exploiting the target's fears about what could happen to him if his secret became public through a criminal proceeding. The ask that followed was financial. The target was asked to send money to help with bail, with legal fees, with whatever specific financial need the constructed crisis required. The amounts started small, manageable sums that a frightened person who trusted the contact could mobilize without destroying their financial life, and escalated through subsequent calls and letters as the manufactured crisis developed new complications requiring additional funds. The genius of the scam, and there is a word for it, even as its application to human misery was monstrous, was its self-concealing quality. The target could not report it to the police without disclosing his sexual orientation and potentially triggering the legal and social consequences he feared. He could not discuss it with family or friends who might have provided the reality check that would have revealed the scam. He was alone with the manufactured crisis and with the person manufacturing it, isolated in the specific way that targeted victims of sophisticated fraud are isolated by design. Nix's design for this operation reflected the specific insight he had developed about human vulnerability. The most reliable lever is the one that its user cannot control or discuss. A man who has been robbed at gunpoint can go to the police. A man who has been defrauded through his own shame cannot, or believes he cannot. That belief is itself the capstone of the scam. The false belief that disclosure is more dangerous than continued payment, that the manufactured crisis can be resolved through money rather than through the very disclosure that the victim most fears. The operation required a network of people making calls and sending correspondence. These people were recruited from within Nix's criminal network. People who owed him loyalty or money, who were available and willing to participate in fraud without access to the victim, and who could be trusted to follow the scripts and protocols that the operation required, without improvising in ways that created exposure. The money from successful extractions was collected through various mechanisms: wire transfers, money orders, sometimes cash sent through the mail in the ways that people who are frightened and isolated and feel they have no alternatives sometimes do. It was aggregated through people in the network who handled the money flows, moved through various accounts and hands, and eventually found its way back toward Kirksey Nix through channels that his people on the outside managed. The money management function was where the law practice connection became essential. The movement of significant cash flows requires people with access to the financial infrastructure, bank accounts, the ability to transfer funds, the business structure that makes large cash movements explicable to the institutions that handle them. A law practice provides exactly this infrastructure, as law firms routinely handle client funds through trust accounts and have the business structure that makes financial movements unremarkable. Pete Hallett's law practice, the practice he ran in partnership with Vincent was, according to the federal investigation's findings, used as a conduit for funds from the Nix telephone scam. The specific mechanics of how this worked, which accounts, which transactions, which explanations were provided for the money movements, were established through financial investigation and through the cooperative witnesses who had knowledge of the arrangements. The Sherry connection. The law partnership that connected Hallett's office to Vincent Sherry and through him to Margaret Sherry is what created the specific chain of circumstances that eventually led to the Sherry's deaths. Margaret Sherry's knowledge of the money flows, or Nix's belief about her knowledge, or her accessibility through the law office connection. One or some combination of these factors placed her in Nix's calculus as a problem requiring his signature resolution. The federal investigation into the telephone scam began not through the Sherry murders, but through financial trails. The movement of money that the scam generated attracted the attention of investigators at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and eventually the FBI, who began following the specific financial patterns that large-scale fraud operations leave in bank records and wire transfer logs. The investigation moved slowly and through multiple jurisdictions because the scam operated nationally. Victims were located across the country, and the money moved across state lines through multiple hands before it reached its ultimate destination. Building the full picture required coordination between federal offices that was not, in the 1980s and early 1990s, as straightforward as the centralizing tendency of subsequent decades would make it. The scam had been generating money for years by the time the investigation caught up with it. The estimates of its total take necessarily approximate, given the cash-intensive nature of parts of the operation, range from several $1 million on the conservative end to higher figures suggested by the scale of the operation and its duration. The victims numbered in the hundreds, spread across the country, and the vast majority of them never came forward to law enforcement because the barrier to doing so remained exactly what Nix's design had intended. Those who did come forward, in some cases, because federal investigators reached them as witnesses rather than as complainants, provided testimony about the operation's mechanics that was essential to the prosecution's case. Their willingness to testify, to disclose in a federal courtroom the vulnerability that had made them targets, was an act of courage that the design of the scam had specifically intended to make impossible. The cooperative witnesses from within the network itself told the other half of the story, the operational side, the money flows, the specific connections between the scam's proceeds and the people on the outside who managed them, and the specific connections between those money flows and the murders of Vincent and Margaret Sherry. Nix's design had included a fundamental logical flaw that he either did not fully recognize or believed he could manage. The people on the outside who knew about the money were also the people who, if they decided to cooperate with federal investigators, could provide the testimony that would destroy everything he had built. He had managed this flaw by creating sufficient fear and dependency in his network to make cooperation seem impossible. When the federal investigation offered cooperation agreements that rebalanced the calculation, making cooperation the less dangerous choice rather than the more dangerous one, the flaw became fatal. Federal investigations of complex criminal enterprises do not move with the speed that crime fiction suggests. They move with the speed of legal proceedings, carefully, documentarily, building records that can withstand the scrutiny of trials and appeals before they are used to make cases that will stick. The federal investigation into Kirksey Nix's operations, the telephone scam, the money flows through Halat's law practice, the Sherry murders, was conducted across multiple years by the FBI's Biloxi field office, working in coordination with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Mississippi, and the various other agencies whose jurisdictions touched different aspects of what was emerging as an extraordinarily complex criminal case. The complexity was not just operational, it was political. Pete Halat had become the mayor of Biloxi in 1989. A federal investigation that was developing evidence of the mayor's involvement in a murder and a fraud scheme was not merely a criminal law enforcement matter. It was a political event of the first order for a city that had already had more than enough political scandal from its historical relationship to organized crime and corruption. The investigators understood this context and navigated it with the care that politically sensitive federal investigations require. Premature disclosure of the investigation's direction, through leaks to the press, through investigative actions that the subjects of the investigation could identify as directed at them, would have given the subjects time to manage their exposure. destroy evidence, and develop legal strategies before the case was fully developed. The cooperation of John Ransom, the witness whose testimony eventually provided the essential link between the Sherry murders and their ultimate commission from inside Parchman Farm, was developed carefully. Ransom had been involved in the periphery of the Nix network and had knowledge of specific transactions and communications that connected the money flows from the telephone scam to the people who managed those flows, and those people to the decision to kill the Sherrys. His cooperation was negotiated through his own legal counsel in the specific way that witness cooperation agreements in federal cases are negotiated, with specific protection in exchange for specific information and testimony. The development of the cooperative witness relationship required the investigators to make representations about their ability to protect Ransom from the consequences of cooperation, consequences that, in the Dixie Mafia universe, included the specific threat of violence from a network that had demonstrated its willingness to use violence against people who became liabilities. This protection was provided through the means available to federal law enforcement: relocation in some cases, monitoring, the formal protections of the Federal Witness Security Program in cases where the threat was severe enough. The difficulty of protecting cooperative witnesses in Dixie Mafia cases was real and was a constraint that the investigators navigated throughout the case's development. Nix's network, despite his physical confinement, retained the capacity to reach people on the outside who had information he needed to protect. Several people who were potential witnesses in various aspects of the case experienced what were described in subsequent proceedings as intimidation attempts. Context that suggested Nix's network was monitoring who was talking to federal investigators. The investigation of Mike Gillich ran parallel to the Halat investigation. Gillich's position as a central node in Biloxi's criminal network, the connector who facilitated relationships between the legitimate-appearing vice economy and the more overtly criminal operations that moved through it, made him a person of specific investigative interest. His relationship to the events surrounding the Sherry murders was developed through financial investigation, through witness accounts, and through the accumulating evidence that Biloxi's criminal establishment had overlapping connections to the specific people and transactions that the investigation was documenting. Gillich eventually made the decision that many criminal figures in his position, facing the accumulated weight of federal evidence, ultimately make. He cooperated. His cooperation, his agreement to provide information and testimony in exchange for reduced exposure, was itself evidence of the calculus that federal investigators had been working to create. When the risk of continued loyalty exceeded the risk of cooperation, cooperation became the rational choice. His testimony, combined with Ransom's, combined with the financial documentation that investigators had assembled across years of following money through bank records and wire transfer logs, produced a case that the federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Mississippi believed could be taken to a jury. The prosecution of Pete Halat in the early 1990s was one of the most significant political prosecutions in Mississippi history. A sitting mayor, the chief executive of the state's second-largest city, being tried on federal racketeering charges connected to a murder conspiracy, was not the kind of case that the federal court system in Mississippi had previously encountered, and the case required careful management of the political and public dimensions that accompanied the criminal dimensions. Halat's defense argued what defenses in such cases typically argue, that the evidence of his specific knowledge and involvement was, insufficient to establish the criminal intent that the charges required, that he had been deceived by people in his professional circle, whose activities he did not fully understand, that his law office's handling of funds that turned out to be connected to criminal activity reflected professional naivety rather than criminal participation. The prosecution's evidence, the cooperative witnesses, the financial documents, the specific communications that connected Halat to knowledge of the money flows and, through the money flows, to knowledge of the murders, was presented across a trial that lasted several weeks and that produced a conviction on racketeering charges. Halat was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The conviction of a sitting mayor on federal racketeering charges connected to a murder conspiracy was the most dramatic single outcome of the investigation into Biloxi's criminal establishment. It was also, in a deeper sense, a partial accounting, a legal resolution that addressed some of the specific criminal acts that the investigation had documented without addressing the broader structural corruption that had allowed those acts to occur within the political and criminal ecosystem of Biloxi over decades. Kirksey Nix himself faced new federal charges related to the telephone scam and the Sherry murders. The charges built on the evidence that the investigation had developed, the cooperative witnesses, the financial documentation, the specific communications from prison that could now be connected to their criminal context. The prosecution of Nix from inside a prison cell was a procedural challenge without clear precedent in the specific combination of charges and circumstances. The existing murder, conviction and life sentence that had put him at Parchman were the foundation of his situation. The new federal charges added layers of legal exposure that his defense team contested at every procedural stage. He was convicted. His sentence was extended. The specific additional time imposed meant that Kirksey Nix was now serving multiple consecutive life sentences, a legal condition that had no practical effect on his physical situation. He was already serving life and would die in prison regardless, but that represented the legal system's acknowledgement of the inoculation of criminal conduct that the investigation had documented from inside the federal prison system to which he was eventually transferred, moving out of the state penitentiary system and into federal custody following the federal convictions. Nix continued to protest his innocence regarding the Sherry murders. His denials were consistent and detailed, and in the specific way of people who have spent their lives managing their legal exposure. They addressed the procedural and evidentiary weaknesses in the prosecution's case, rather than providing the kind of direct denial that innocent people typically offer. The federal investigation's reach extended to several other figures in the network who had served Nix's operations in various capacities. Not all of them were prosecuted. Not all of the evidence developed across years of investigation was sufficient to produce criminal charges that prosecutors believed they could sustain at trial. The gap between what investigators knew and what they could prove, a gap that is always present in complex criminal cases, particularly those involving networks without formal structure, was significant in the Dixie Mafia context. The structural feature of the Dixie Mafia that had made it resistant to law enforcement for decades, its lack of formal organization, its reliance on personal relationships and reputation rather than documented membership and formal hierarchy, continued to create investigative and prosecutorial challenges, even as the investigation was producing convictions. You could convict specific people for specific acts. You could not prosecute the network itself, because the network did not exist in the formal sense that criminal conspiracy law requires to reach it as an entity. What the investigation had accomplished was significant within these limitations. It had convicted the most powerful criminal figure to emerge from the Dixie Mafia universe, along with the political figure most directly embedded in his operations. It had produced a detailed public record, through trial testimony, through court filings, through the journalism that the prosecutions attracted, of how the Gulf Coast's criminal establishment had operated for decades. What it had not done was change the underlying conditions that had produced the criminal establishment in the first place. The corruption that was endemic to the political and law enforcement structures of the Mississippi Gulf Coast was not eliminated by the prosecution of Pete Hallat. The criminal networks that ran through Biloxi's vice economy were not destroyed by the conviction of Kirksey Nix on additional charges. The specific culture of tolerance for criminal activity that generations of political accommodation had produced in the Gulf Coast communities did not dissolve because federal prosecutors had finally reached the people at the center of its most visible expression. What changed was the specific actors at the top of the existing criminal hierarchy. The positions they vacated were filled by others, operating in some of the same spaces and some new ones, adapting to the changed environment that the federal prosecutions had created without fundamentally altering the environment's essential character. The walls had closed on Kirksey Nix and Pete Hallat and the specific criminal operations they had run. The walls had not closed on the conditions that made those operations possible.